Welcome, everybody, to tonight's program. I'm Jackie Terraza, and I am the Colby College Museum of Art Carolyn Mussey Director, and it is my pleasure to have you with us tonight. I hope that you have a wonderful evening with us as part of this program. And this evening is part of the museum series Art and, which brings together visiting artists, scholars, museum staff, and community experts for conversations about exhibitions, our collections, and projects that are taking place at the Colby Museum and at its Lunder Institute for American Art. And importantly, the series brings together people to engage with the issues of our time. Just a couple of practicalities before we get going. The conversation portion will last about 40 minutes, and it will be followed by a Q&A. And during the conversation, feel free to use your Q&A button on the Zoom toolbar to submit your questions so that we can have them at the Q&A portion. To learn about future events that the Colby Museum is organizing, especially on campus and in Waterville, please visit the events page on the museum's website and follow us on social media. And that will include also Lunder Institute of Art events. So this exhibition, Radical Histories, Chicanx Prints from the Smithsonian American Art Museum, is organized by the Smithsonian American Art Museum. And I'm so grateful for the museum for the opportunity to bring this important story to Waterville, Maine. Following Colby, those of you on the West Coast will be able to see the show at the Huntington Library, Art Museum, and Botanical Gardens in San Marino, California. So when I think about art, I think about the fact that art making is an act of freedom. And for me, that means that it's the freedom to use one's capacity for expression and imagination to produce something that didn't exist before. And this results in artworks that draw viewers' attention, inviting us to explore, to wonder, to experience new ways of seeing and understanding both ourselves and our world. This exhibition presents an important story from the broader art history of the United States and its relationship through the Americas, plural. It focuses on how Chicanx and Latinx artists have used printmaking to mobilize, to commemorate, and to educate about the experiences of their communities in the United States. All of the artworks are prints, and they are made to exist in multiples and to circulate widely. They are also part of a long history of socially engaged printmaking across Latin American communities. At the Colby Museum, exhibitions are opportunities for learning, and they play a really important role in our mission to be a forum for dialogue, for experimentation, for research, and for joyful connection. When we present projects like this one here at the Colby Museum, we aim to bring different kinds of people together around artworks that invite us to consider the complexity of the American experience, one that is connected to a global context and that more specifically is hemispheric, diasporic, indigenous, and plural. My most sincere thanks to the two people who will be part of this conversation and leading us away for making this exhibition and its presentation here at Colby possible, and to Claudia Zapata for curating the exhibition. I also want to thank our outstanding team here at the Colby Museum for realizing it so beautifully in our galleries. Our moderator tonight is Julianne Gilland, and Julianne is currently our Deputy Director for Planning and Operations here at the museum. Prior to joining Colby, she served as the director and curator of the Benson Latin American Collection at the University of Texas at Austin, which is one of the world's premier special collections and libraries of U.S., Latinx, and Latin American history, arts, and culture. Before this, Julianne served as deputy director at the Robbins Collection Research Center at the University of California at Berkeley, where she also earned her PhD in history. Our guest is Claudia Zapata, currently the Blanton Museum of Art's first associate curator of Latino art. They earned their PhD in art history at Southern Methodist University, and the program was the Rhetorics of Art, Space, and Culture program, and their BA and MA in art history from the University of Texas at Austin. From 2010 to 2014, they were the curator of exhibitions and programs at the Mexic Art Museum, and from 2018 to 2022, they were curatorial assistant of Latinx art at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. Among their many achievements, Claudia was part of UCLA's first cohort of Chancellor's postdoctoral fellows administered by the Chicano Research Center. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Julianne and Claudia. And again, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much, Jackie. I couldn't be more excited to have opened Radical Histories at Colby this week. It really is so stunning and spectacular in our galleries, and I invite everyone who is able to come see the show in person to please do so. Come experience it between now and the end of its run in early June. But for tonight, I'm equally excited to have this opportunity to talk with Claudia Zapata, the exhibition's curator. Thank you so much for being with us, Claudia. And I wanted to jump right in by talking a little bit about the title of the show and the terminology. This exhibition is about Chicanx Prints from the 1960s to today, and the show begins with a note about terminology and the uses of Chicano, Chicana, and Chicanx. So when we say the term Chicanx, how do you think about or define this term in relation to the histories of these works? Can you provide some grounding and context for this for us? And if we can have the next slide, please.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you so much to all the Smithsonian staff for making this show travel to you. It's interesting when you're doing Chicano shows because the first question is, what is Chicano? And it's one of these moments where you want to say everything and nothing at the same time because it is very challenging in terms of a concept to describe what it means because it changes regionally and it changes chronologically as well. And so when we're thinking about Chicano, this slide is very helpful because you can see all the variations of this term. So all these versions are in use today. And so some of these range in terms of more popular usages by mainly scholars and then also different communities. It's very challenging to be very adept to changing with the times. For example, if you're identifying a research center or a research studies or discipline of a college or something like that, that's a little harder to change. But if you're thinking about like metadata or a user posting something on Instagram and they use a specific tag, that's a little bit more nimble as to how they're employing Chicano. Historically, Chicano has primarily been associated with Mexican American, and Mexican American identifications with the term are somewhat limiting. And it's interesting when we're promoting this show because the first thing is in a press release explaining what Chicano, Chicana, and Chicanx are. And really we're thinking about multiple languages. We're thinking about English, we're thinking about Spanish, and then we're thinking about indigenous languages. We're thinking about Nahuatl. And so Chicano really is a pejorative term. Historically, it was seen as a negative. You're Chicano. It wasn't a great thing. It was someone who was challenging their culture. This was this defiance of someone who wasn't attuned to their culture in terms of Mexicanidad or Mexicanness. And so to be called a Chicano was someone who was not fully Mexican. And there's this in-betweenness that's prevalent throughout the show, throughout the works, throughout many of the concepts. And Chicano was then reclaimed by several social activists. There's a large movement known as the Chicano movement or El Movimiento of the 1960s. So there's different applications of the nomenclature of thinking about it as a historical term of the Chicano movement and thinking about this as a an ideology of Chicanismo, and then thinking about it as a personal identifier of I am Chicano, I am Chicana, I am Chicanx. Chicana is associated with the Spanish gender ending of woman, Chicano associated with men. And then now over time, it's transformed to thinking about the X as this gender neutral. And so this is very interesting because each institution who exhibits this sort of artwork, they can oscillate between OAX and what's in fashion right now is Chicana, Chicano, Chicanx, and then the sort of backslash between those. And now what's happening is an E ending with a Chican with an E. It's more popular with like Latinx and Latine that you're seeing that. It hasn't picked up as much momentum with the Chicano. But thinking about those terms in the historical sense, in the national sense, in the political consciousness, it's not necessarily you are from Mexico or you are a Mexican American and you're using Chicano. It's more about, are you associating yourself? Are you living with a political consciousness really to fight anti-oppression work? So many of the artists who are in the Chicano arts movement, they're not necessarily of Mexican descendancy. For example, one of the artists in the show is a staunch Chicano artist, and they're from Peru. So there are these instances where those stories of someone from Central America, someone from Latin America, employing that term and very much seeing their art as that activism. So you'll see different variations. Their Chicano art doesn't look one way, but this show is a good 101 of what are the major themes of Chicano printmaking, and Chicanx printing. What does it look like? What can we learn from it? How do you discern that from other activist printmaking?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's really helpful. And I think what you're pointing to is something people that you definitely experience within the show, that these questions of identity are very personal. They can also be very community based and also are often based on people's relationship or identification with a particular moment in time too. So thank you for that insight into that to get us started. Um, Turning to the show, Radical Histories is essentially a sequel to the groundbreaking landmark show that Sam put on in 2020, Printing the Revolution. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the history of both of these shows, really, and their inception, and what was some of the urgency that you, as an institution, Smithsonian American Art Museum, felt in sharing these stories.
Sure, let's look at some art. Let's go to the next slide.
All right.
Okay, I'm still on the Chicano list. If we could go to at least, yeah, that one, there's fine.
Thank you.
Well, what's great about the Smithsonian American Art Museum at that time was there was a curator, and how I got attached to the project for Printing the Revolution. Very much, if printing the revolution is this universe that this show Radical Histories is a part of. It's part of that networked experience. And Printing the Revolution was an exhibition, as a permanent collection show that opened in 2020 during every possible hindrance of developing an exhibition, from COVID to January 6th to riots to everything. And it was a very apropos show for change because all of the artwork was related to shifting times and supporting injustices and social justice. Very many of the works are timeless looking as to the call for change is something that could be applied to present day. And at that moment in the 2018, when I was attached to the project, Carmen Ramos, who's now at the National Gallery, she was the Sam's curator of Latinx art. and she invited me to help work on the project and help with her research and help develop the show. And at Smithsonian, it was very much about developing an exhibition, but also realizing as you're developing an exhibition how much still needs to be acquired to properly tell those stories. And so it's interesting if you look at those years of certain things being acquired. A permanent collection show is usually something that you've had kind of for a while, and it's a show that an institution brings up to showcase what's the work that's been done for several years. So it's interesting showing some of the older works that have been in the collection because of Tomás Ibarra Frausto, one of the major Chicano scholars of all Chicano art history, the godfather of Chicano art history. He donated several works in the 90s to SAM. And then building from that collection, Carmen received several donations from different collectors from all over the country, and then also started acquiring new works while developing the show. So luckily that was all before 2020's cutoff of travel and things like that. So she and I were able to travel all over the country and develop the show and propose a 300% increase to the collection, to the Latinx collection. And with that, when you're trying to build a show that's large, that's as large as that, there's about 119 works in Printing the Revolution versus Radical Histories, which you all have, which is 60. It's a very different conversation where a really large show is trying to answer so many things. And it's really trying to get a good coverage of the state of the field of American printmaking and Chicanx art, Latinx art, and really trying to get a national coverage because it's the Smithsonian. So there's this desire not to stay regional. It's really trying to tell the American story. And we're thinking American, it's like US, but also Puerto Rico and things like that. We're trying to understand what's going on nationally. And with that, it's very challenging because you're trying to do so much that so many shows haven't done in the past. There's just been such a gap in literature and publications, in specialties, exhibition catalogs, and just frankly, just funding for telling this story in the history of printmaking and the history of political arts and the history of Latinx and Chicanx art. There's so much that still needs to be told. So even if there's some artists that may be familiar, if at all, we're still just telling the preliminary story of their life and their work. And so each new exhibition to this content is going to uncover further stories and further contextualize the work as to why it was made during this political moment. That's not just Cesar Chavez, but what else was going on? What other contestations were happening? Or what other developments were made in the advancement of certain technical practices for these art makers? So when we're thinking about a show that follows another show, very similarly themed, what are we missing from the first project that we can focus on a little bit more? What other stories, when we were developing the research, were we thinking we can come back to that? Or maybe that's just a footnote, and maybe that footnote now turns into a theme that we're focusing on. It's any lineage and this evolution of thinking that a researcher has to pursue that knowledge and to really understand the complexity of this discipline and translate that to a visitor who's really coming into this without any knowledge, for example. This is the challenge of any movie sequel. You can't rely on the first one. You have to be able to see the second one and still be okay. So how do you do that when you're developing a second show where it's covering the basic and understanding of foundation to give to the visitor, but also bringing in new stories and bringing in new characters? So this work, for example, Malaquias Montoya, one of the major printmakers of Chicano art. He's still with us. This is also another very interesting challenge with this artwork. There are several living artists, which is amazing. They're very excited they're in these shows. They're excited they're finally getting their shot. And some people are very, it's a very interesting response where they'll say something to the effect of, I didn't even think this was going to ever be considered for the Smithsonian. We couldn't give it away. There's been some responses for that, for the more functional or utilitarian political works, or the more challenging works where there was backlash to them, for example. It's interesting when we receive several donations from certain collectors that literally pulled prints off walls or telephone poles. And so that tension between institutional practice of conservation and political utility. So why is it so shocking to see tape on the back of a print versus you're used to seeing this very pristine sort of object? And this was these moments that were very interesting where someone would just be so aghast as to why was this treated so poorly versus why was this employed so much? There's very specific perspectives that would have to happen when looking at these different works, like Malachius's Chicano Moratorium, which is this is little prints. There's different color versions, but they're very functional. This is an event poster talking about a protest. And so this end result for many of the works is often not in a fine art collection. It's often ended up in library archives and in other spaces. Having that and ability to interpret this as not a study collection or not a archival collection, but part of the fine art collection. That discerning by a curatorial eye and a certain level of connoisseurship remnants, that's also what's been challenging for these types of works that are specifically like event posters, for example. But it's an interesting question that comes up with all of the work.
Yeah. Well, I think that, I mean, that's such a vivid image, right, of something that's being taken off, a telephone pole or something, and then is ending up in a fine art collection, and wanting to kind of tell that story with that first major show, right, to kind of introduce artists to amplify the work of artists to new audiences, and so that expansiveness of that desire to focus on those artists, these practices as ones that deserve that attention and that consideration within the sort of larger um, fine art context. And I think that's where Radical Histories has this opportunity, not even really, I would say, as a sequel, but as a kind of a complement, the opportunity to dig in and tell a different story, to your point, really taking the kind of the medium of printmaking as the basis for kind of exploring, why was it so effective and so desirable a means for artists, for activists, and for communities to to get a message out there, and to really kind of explore those the blurred lines between the functional item, the archival item, and the artwork. Next slide, please. Yeah, there we go. One more. There we go. So I'm thinking immediately of this example that really strikes right to the heart of that that question. I'd love it if you could tell us a little bit more about this work.
Sure, this is Louis, they call him Louis the Foot, like the foot, like a foot. Louis the Foot Gonzalez. So he's part of Royal Chicano Air Force. Royal Chicano Air Force was a Northern California, Sacramento art collective. There are several books by Ella Diaz about the collective through UT Press, if you want to learn more. They are very prolific in terms of many, many event posters, different themes of urban figures, portraits, using Mesoamerica often as a reference point, developing protest posters specifically for the UFW. Many of the members acted as security for Cesar Chavez when he was in Sacramento. And what's interesting about this one, this was the title of a very famous exhibition and an exhibition catalog that was referencing UC Santa Barbara's archives of Chicano art. So this is from the late 90s, and it was called this Just Another Poster. And this is a backlash against a reviewer of one of the RCAF's shows. So one of the critics had told the RCAF to throw away their images, throw away their posters, because it was just a poster. This is also this very much of a challenge with the medium of printmaking, as in any medium in a collection, there is a hierarchy, or any markets. There's a hierarchy in printmaking and in general art making, or you think painting and sculpture. But the multiple, everything works on paper, is very much at the lower end of this market valuation. And anything that's like an offset print, which is like mechanical reproduction, or even screen print for the longest time, which is the medium of most of the show, was very much seen as this industrial practice. It didn't have as much allure. Oftentimes it's not taught in fine art school. The workshops and print centers that were seen as of a higher value didn't teach it. And because of its low cost nature, and the print centers that Latino and Chicano artists and communities developed specifically for screen printing, using screen printing, and teaching it to the communities, it took on a whole other life. And just because of the rapid nature and the cost efficiency of it. So this is just another poster, is this reaction to that critic, and just in general for thinking about the art world broadly.
Yeah.
And in it says boycott Coors and boycott Gallo specific companies, Gallo wines and Coors, like Coors the beer. So it's a political poster. That is so little. It's more of this conceptual conversation to the art world. And Louis was a poet. And so several of Royal Chicano Air Force's endeavors for poetry and theater and things like that. So there was this ever mixture with satire and humor and textual play. So it's a good example of challenging this very somber interpretation of oppression that often gets associated with aggrieved groups generally, where it's just always depressing and sad. Actually, there's a lot of humor and there's a lot of wit to contestation, and you see that in many of the works in the show, and Chicano and Chicanx art, obviously.
Yeah. I'm glad you said that, because I was thinking exactly that same thing, that it's a really wonderful example of a constant thread throughout the exhibition and amongst these works, which is that they are in many different ways, challenging expectations, challenging authority and hierarchies, challenging accepted histories, um, and even questioning kind of the way people have traditionally understood certain kinds of identities. We have the next slide, please. And so identity being another, and exploring that being another, through line, I would say, through all of the different parts of the show. I would love to spend a minute, though, digging in a little further and talking about more specifically about some of the other key themes of the show. Could you say a little bit about that?
Sure. So the way that the show is organized, it's one section, for example, it's called Together We Fight. And that's based off of one of the phrases in one of the prints related to the United Farm Workers. So this is specifically protest images. These are calls for action. These are references to specific moments in political history where there's a desire for mobilization. And then the next section is called Guerra No, or War No, where we're looking at several different reflections on war. So a lot of the
And
night.
can we go through the slides as Claudia is talking about these different sections?
Sure, this is part of, for example, Together We Fight. This is a beautiful image. It's very small, like a little bit smaller than computer paper. And I remember I asked Amado, I said, why is it so small? And whenever you're a scholar, you want this very complex reason as to why artists do certain things. You think everything has heavy duty meaning. And he said, well, it's cheaper. I got to cut paper down into as little as possible. I didn't have any money. So it's always just like, oh, okay. Why that color? That's what was there. So I ran into that a lot. You run into a lot of different moments of the realistic nature of an artist and the realistic nature of just someone trying to make do, really, with what they have. This concept of l'esquachismo, which Tomás Ibarra Frausto famously wrote about, and is very much present in a lot of the works. And so this one is, it's very small, but the color is so potent. Really, it's one of those that doesn't transfer to digital that well. Is the orange is so bright. It's neon almost.
Yeah,
And
that was a wonderful surprise for us, having seen these works right on our computer screens and on paper for so long before the show actually arrived to Colby, and then unpacking the works and seeing that vividness, that neon of that orange in person. And interestingly, I'll just add as a side note, um, another work in this section of the show, also with a extremely vivid, arresting neon orange. It's a kind of a monochromatic print on computer paper, on old from the 1970s or early 80s, old dot matrix computer paper with the the holes along the two sides that it would spool through the old printers in. And this being a material that was very often used for printmaking, political, making protest posters, all kinds of political printmaking, because so many folks, educators as well as students, and people who were, in their daily lives, had access to this kind of paper, and were able to use it to, kind of create on the fly to some extent. Sometimes with collective, poster making sessions, or using it in a much more for a much more fine art printing process. But anyway, that's a really interesting material aspect of some of these works. So thank you for
yeah,
highlighting that.
the substrates can get interesting. Like there was a folder in Printing the Revolution, like a manila folder someone used because they just needed something. And for Amado's work, Welga, and when we're thinking about the really technicolor, lustrous images, a lot of it was oil-based paint. And this was this real hazard, actually, with a lot of the older printmakers, is that they were getting sick from using these oil-based paints. And then eventually it became water-based paints. So there is a difference in terms of what the chemical makeup was of the paint, at the detriment of the health of many of the printmakers. And so that was a real issue where people were getting very they were saying there's no such thing as an old printmaker because of this, because of the hazards.
Wow.
Anyway.
Well, I took you off track with that little side note about materials. If we can have the next slide, you were talking about another section of the show, Guerra No.
Sure. So this is where we can see specific references to certain wars. Oftentimes the focus is the Vietnam War, and the anti-Vietnam War work of many of the artists of the 60s and the 70s. This is an example of that, of certain bombings. And this is an interesting paper because on the back, this was reused. So there's a functional piece of paper. It's like it was like a poster. And so this was given away for a certain amount, like very like donation prices. And Oscar Milata is still alive. You can still follow him today. And this theme has references to Iraq and Central America, El Salvador, and obviously anti-Vietnam. And this is just something that is so present. Many of the artists were veterans. They dealt with that experience. They dealt with solidarity. So this was this ongoing practice where even if it wasn't necessarily affecting them specifically with like the Vietnam War and being a veteran or dealing with the communities that were being lost because of the influx of drafting amongst Black and Brown communities, even if it's in another side of the world, there's still this solidarity with oppressed groups. And so those images are very present of we're supporting you and this is how we can support you. Oftentimes, many of the prints were sold for fundraising, certain committees, certain organizations. So several printmakers had to deal with being approached to do things pro bono in order just to support the cause, and others did it on their own right. But it's a very common that they knew some about the issue if it's something not connected to them, but as they weren't necessarily completely involved in that issue. They were mainly seen as this sort of artistic technician that was able to translate what was going on and make people understand very quickly what the issues were at hand.
Mm-hmm.
And then
Yeah.
the next section is violent divisions.
Next
And
slide, please. Yeah, thanks.
this is really thinking about the US-Mexico border. And this is a good example of a section that's a closer look from the previous Printing the Revolution show, where we can get very specific to, and by the border, I mean, that's seems like such a large topic to sound specific, but this is where we can we can have a very much side conversation considering how much is referenced by several of these artists of the US-Mexico border and the borderlands, and really thinking about that's why this section isn't necessarily called the border or US Mexico. Violent divisions is very much about challenging the concept that lands can be torn up politically, that it can be designated. Like the act of that to me is very violent. And so that's why this is called that, because we're thinking about the tensions of that approach to land and thinking about what are the issues in those spaces. Like Margarita Cabrera, one of the works, she's an amazing artist of the Southwest. And this is a great print that was produced in Austin, Texas, actually. This was through the Seri project. And this, if you see it in person, you're able to see it's mixed media. So there's threads and this sort of leather attached to this screen print. And Margarita, if you know her work, she's very famous for making these commercial products and the sort of hand-done nature to like blenders and toasters. A very famous one is where she did this large Volkswagen. And so she's making these certain products that are related to the factories along the US-Mexico border and the exploitation of the labor, largely the women's force that's acting as the workforce for these factories that really sprung up when we're thinking about the North American Free Trade Agreement post that, and the issues that are involved with corporations producing commercial products that we use all the time, and this absence of a hand of a worker. And so we see these threads is this reference to the laborer's hand where we think, okay, someone actually made this, versus the sterile nature of products and the perfection that we need to see, which creates this anonymous labor force. So the next section is Rethinking America. And this is the collection really speaking to certain holidays like the bicentennial, the anniversary of Columbus, and certain really triggering holidays that are about nationhood or thinking about the history of the nation. This is an interesting example because Patricia Rodriguez, she's very famous for being part of the Mujeres Muralistas, the San Francisco Women's Mural Collective. And so this is a portfolio from the Royal Chicano Air Force. They asked different artists to produce a month. So calendars, they're very common format amongst Chicanx Prints, Chicanx printmaking. This was this way of providing artwork to a home at an affordable price. And there's this utility to it, like you can actually use it as a calendar. I've seen certain prints used as calendars, and it's somewhat shocking, but you're realizing that's how it was sold. And this is a common format amongst Chicano printmakers, is the calendar. And so Patricia Rodriguez, she was invited to this History of California suite. And so each artist talked about different moments in the history of California. And Patricia went to talk on about different moments in criminal history for women. And she's referencing certain cases where women fought in self-defense of themselves or their family and eventually were tried or hung as a result of that. So this is this form of this feminist movement icons. And then the next section is change makers. So this is one of the same themes of printing the revolution, because it's such a strong presence of portraits amongst Chicanx printmakers. This is through line from all these generations, from 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s to today, of portraiture. Why? So many people see their histories untold. So many communities do not see themselves in history books, in community statues, in public art, you name it. So the prints often act as this recognition or this pedagogical tool to telling unsung hero stories. This is a good example. This is a folkloric healer from Texas. And so there's a small kind of chapel shrine for him. So he was known as a healer, and people would send him letters and come to be near him to get healed. And so this is by Cesar Martinez. Cesar Martinez is very much known for his pachucos and his urban figures, a very specific high fashion. So it's an interesting approach to take to this folkloric healer, where it looks almost like a fashion shoot. He looks very regal. And this is someone that there's a marker for in Texas, but really you would never know necessarily about this figure in mainstream history. So this is a good example of one of many in the changemaker section of poets and healers and radical figures that need to be inserted into our histories.
Yeah, thank you. There's so much depth to the show and in each of these sections. And two, it's really wonderful how there are these really strong through lines that connect all of them. So it's not so much that there's a chronology or a narrative, one narrative, but importantly that there are so many, and so many kind of voices and perspectives. Another through line, and something I wanted to ask you about, we have a little bit more time before we want to maybe save some time for taking questions from the audience, but you talked a little bit about sort of these artists, some of them really kind of working with various degrees of engagement in or involvement in a collective effort, be it a social justice effort, a political movement, whatever. Um, uh, but there are strong threads of collectivism in different ways reflected through these works, as well as in looking at these prints and printmakers, intergenerational mentorship and place, the place and the places in which these printmakers are working and acting together. Um, so I wonder if you could just say a little bit about that piece, some of those interconnections between generations of artists who are, mentorship type relations, the role of graphic workshops as places of community, of education, and of artistic collective practice.
Yeah, there's so many examples of artistic exchange and conceptual exchange. I think that's also what's very interesting about this type of show and this moment in artwork is that there's so much overlap. So several of the elder artists are very much alive, and so they're still teaching or they've mentored artists that are younger. And so it's interesting. I've been in certain conversations where an audience member is asking how younger artists are looking different. Like, how can they change? How can they make themselves stick out and look different? And the nature of it is that it's going to look so similar to the elder artists because they just had such a heavy influence on them artistically and conceptually. Sometimes younger artists, if we could change it to the favela image by Chico Gonzalez. It's
Couple
the
more, few
one
more.
one more.
Going. One more. There you
Right.
go.
Like Chico Gonzalez, for example, he was a student of Ricardo Favela, who's deceased. Ricardo Favela was part of the Royal Chicano Air Force. He always wore a hat. There's so many hats in Chicano art. And Ricardo Favela was a teacher at Sacramento State, and Chico was one of his students and eventually started working with him and eventually started teaching one of his classes. And so I mentioned the classes because, again, it's tied to a consciousness. So there's the technical aspect that's being shared amongst the artists, but there's also the social consciousness, the teachings, and the understandings of what's at play in this social justice realm and the similar issues of interest. I'm really thinking about the challenges that each generation has had to deal with. That's very much the same challenge. So they're not necessarily brand new issues, but these sort of like large color blocks and this approach to this image, for example, like favela, a lot of these images, if it's the younger artist, they often make dedicatory portraits of the elder artist. Like there's also another image of the show in the show by Jesus Barraza, who's acknowledging Barbara Carrasco. There's Malaquias Montoya and Carlos Jackson. There's so many people tied to Rupert Garcia, and there's so many people tied to Juan Fuentes. Everyone is often pointing at one another as an influence. And so the imagery overlaps and the honorific nature of how do you reference an elder in this positive way. And for example, like this is through portraiture, and the very specific color choices in this work are referencing the life of Ricardo Favela by his student Chico. Like the green is referencing the militant nature of Royal Chicano Air Force and what they would wear, and the rebel star, and these sort of features. All of this is part of that knowledge, acknowledging the connection amongst the community and understanding the continuation of the same practice technically and consciously. So a lot of this is also regional. So like Northern California, Southern California, where there's more overlap is with the print centers, or if there was travel by, like for example, Malakias traveled to many different locations around the nation and gave certain classes. Like he, for example, did a class at UTSA, the University of Texas, San Antonio, and him working in that classroom influenced Juan de Dios Mora, who's also in the show.
Mhm.
So even though Juan is from Laredo and from Mexico, he was influenced by a Northern Californian because of the way that that printmaker traversed the nation. And oftentimes that was due to the collectors like Ricardo Romo or Gilberto Cárdenas that understood how to move the printmakers through classes, through universities and things like that, or through print seminars. There was this desire to disperse the knowledge, disperse the information that each of the elder printmakers had. So, and the willingness by the elder printmaker for that collaboration or for
Yep.
that exchange.
Could we go forward 2 slides? And I do want to head us into a little bit of Q&A from others, but I thought maybe we could just spend one more minute talking about this work, which is, you know, one of my favorites in the show. It's really powerful. It's a larger format work by Carlos Francisco Jackson, and it came to mind as you were talking because this is another example of an artist of a slightly younger generation working with Malaquias Montoya in Northern California. They founded a print workshop together, partly affiliated with UC Davis. And, you know, so it's highlighting so many of those things that you were just talking about. The kind of intermingling and the multiple identities and roles of many of these artists as educators as well. And interestingly, I heard Carlos talking in a kind of a TED talk that he did about how, and he's probably said this in other formats too, how he, as someone who's also in addition to practicing as a visual artist, right, is working as a Chicano studies professor and realizing that his students today don't necessarily know, aren't aware of some of the key histories of these communities. And so that being the inspiration, for instance, for a print like this, that's documenting a key historical moment, in this case with Cesar Chavez and the end of his hunger strike to advance the cause of the United Farm Workers in 1968. Claudia, let's turn to some questions, and also too, I invite you, if there's anything else you want visitors to think about or consider when they explore this exhibition. I'd love to hear from that from you as well. But I want to here's a question that we've got from someone asking about sort of the future, really. The show is about generations and histories, but what in the show, what does the show have to say or point to about the future of Chicanx printmaking?
Sure. So there's a good example by Chico Gonzalez and the exhibition. It's a portrait of Angela Davis. And that was part of this series of portraits that he did for these certain actions where he used this augmented reality app. It no longer exists. It's suffering technological obsolescence, unfortunately. But we acquired it while the app was still alive, and we acquired the video asset that was associated with it. But there's these movements forward by younger artists to explore different aspects of technology and obviously digital culture. It's very interesting when you think of the prints by the younger artists, because oftentimes it looks like an elder artist but then it's a very contemporary issue, or is it very specific to a technological moment that jumps its age out at you? So there are these interesting adaptations of the younger artists to obviously incorporate their present day issues and employ different approaches to thinking about capturing voices. Like that's why Chico used the AR, was to get an interview of an activist onto this image of an elder activist. So this continuation of the layering concept of printmaking, but now using this this digital layer for the user and for the visitor. So these are the examples of where it's being pushed forward.
Yeah. Well, there are a couple of questions here that are getting to maybe two sides of the same coin. You talked a little bit when you were talking about Printing the Revolution, that first larger show, really ending up coming into being during a very complicated political, social, cultural moment in, as it opened in 2020. And, we are in another moment of a lot of um, important, complex things happening. And wondering, someone wanted to hear about kind of what the public response was to Printing the Revolution in that moment. And I'm wondering if that maybe connects with that question I just sort of unfairly glommed on to the first question I asked you about, maybe what you hope visitors will take away from experiencing this show.
Sure. Well, when Printing the Revolution came out, it was 2020, and the reactions, I mean, there were different preoccupations with the reception. From certain prints may get attacked. There may be bomb threats. I mean, during January 6th, there were concerns of the museum being attacked, all sorts of things of that moment, of wondering how the works were going to be received. Historically, several of the works have been more controversial. Certain artists' works have been attacked. So there was, and this is the critical nature of the workers in a museum that are on site, is to be that front line for that. So they're doing such critical work in this conversation, where I'm reflecting on it in this very specific way, where there may be very specific reactions in the museum. But at that time in 2020, when it was finally opened after the shutdown of COVID, it was very well received, and people are just very interested in the content. The imagery is so vibrant, and there's so many stories, there's so many points of entrance. It's not a very one line, one character. And there's all, again, these different approaches we're taking to it. Like, for example, when we're thinking about Julio Salgado's work, that if we're thinking about that image, if we could bring that up, for example,
If we go one more. Just one more slide. There we go.
when we're thinking about this image, especially at this current moment, and we're thinking about raids, we're thinking about detention centers, and we're thinking about the real fear that's going on for migrant communities. Unfortunately, several works in the show, there's another image by Irene Cervantes that's showing an immigrant running away at rapid speed. So this isn't just of this specific moment, it's an ongoing issue for the danger of immigrants. But what's very comforting about this work, and that what makes it very apropos for thinking about the current moment, is that it very much acknowledges that there's so many communities resisting, that it's not this defeatist attitude of, well, this is going to happen. There's so many generations of resistance that have dealt with every level of oppression internationally. And it's a very good example when you're walking through the exhibition to see so many points of resistance by artists that will not back down. They will not be told to be quiet. Their histories will not be erased. This is part of acknowledging and printmaking acting as a mouthpiece for people who want more and demand more, and they're not going away. And so these sort of erasure that we're seeing in histories, online, websites, books, people, these are perfect objects and perfect archival moments and beautiful masterpieces, acknowledging that that sort of approach will never be successful.
Yeah. I think that that is a very powerful and perfect way to wrap up this conversation. Thank you so much, Claudia, for sharing so much of these insights and so much of what went into the making of this really beautiful, thought-provoking show. And I want to thank everyone joining us here this evening. And once again, invite you, come see the show. Thank you so much.